Welcome to the third conversation in the Wallace Foundation series, Reimagining the Future of the Arts. We are so glad that you're with us today for what I think will be a really important conversation. I'm Mark Skorka, President and CEO of Opera America. This summer, I was really honored to be among about a dozen leaders in the arts and related fields who were brought together as an advisory board for AEA Consulting. The firm monitors global trends that impact the arts and the cultural sector. And together, we considered a question that may be causing lots of people to lose their sleep. How can nonprofit arts organizations plan for the future when there are so many unknowns? That question was the starting point for AEA's research team. Now, Daniel Payne, we're going to be hearing from him in just a moment, is the firm's managing principal. He'll join us with a new report that looks at trends and possible scenarios in light of COVID-19, the social justice movement, and other factors that are changing how we live and work. He'll also introduce a new scenario planning toolkit that is intended to help your organizations think productively about a future or possible futures whose contours remain highly uncertain. Then we'll hear from some arts leaders who understand the challenges and the benefits of scenario planning. They'll reflect with us on the central challenge of how we look forward. Joining us will be Christina Newman Scott, who is the president of BRIC, a wonderful arts organization in Brooklyn, whose work spans contemporary visual and performing arts, media, and civic action. We'll be joined too by Elizabeth Merritt, who is the American Alliance of Museums resident futurist and vice president for strategic foresight. She's also the founding director of the Center for the Future of Museums. And finally, we'll be joined by Stephanie Ibarra, who is the artistic director of Baltimore's Center Stage. Now, each season, the theater in normal seasons welcome over 100,000 people. Its eclectic programming for audiences of all ages is based on the core values of community engagement and access for all. Now, throughout the presentation, your questions are welcome. And I would ask that you go to the bottom of your screen where there's a Q&A box. Don't enter questions in chat. Use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many of these questions as we can toward the end of our time together. Today's session is being recorded and will be available at wallacefoundation.org. There you'll find the presentation slides, links to reports, and past event recordings. So let's get started. It's a pleasure to introduce Daniel Payne of AEA Consulting. Daniel, take it away.
Thanks, Mark, and it is a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and thanks to the Wallace Foundation for hosting us all for this great conversation. I'm going to start us off today with a bit of background about the scenario planning work we've done and how we think it might be applied to help organizations think about the future. The genesis of the work was some research we were doing for the Wallace Foundation investigating how the arts and culture sector would and could respond in the wake of COVID. Work that was recently published as a report called Arts Organizations' Early Response to COVID-19 Uncertainty, Insights from the Field. A bit of a mouthful, but it was really interesting research, and it included a literature review, a survey of 118 arts leaders from a range of disciplines and organizational sizes, and 44 interviews with leaders from the US as well as Australia, India, and the UK about how organizations were responding. And what we found in this research was that there were some immediate consensus impacts. First, a move to the digital space for programming and to rebuild connections to audiences. And of course, we're now used to seeing lots of programs on YouTube and of course Zoom, like today. Second, there was a clear disparate impact from the inequality of resources available to culturally specific organizations and the larger legacy institutions. An impact that was made only more stark after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement taking on increased prominence over the summer, and resulting in even more calls for the sector to grapple with its legacies of institutional racism. And then third, our research found a shared uncertainty around forward planning, both in near-term questions around when organizations might have been able to reopen their doors, but also around longer term issues such as the ongoing impacts of the climate crisis, increasing economic inequality, the continued emergence of new technologies, political polarization, and so on. And these near term impacts also carried forward into the longer term planning window. Leaders in the sector saw likely changes to operating models and audience behaviors. They saw these effects as generational changes arrived, and COVID's impact on seniors brought additional challenges for participation from older audience segments in particular. And as the socioeconomic divide grows as a result of both prior trends toward increased inequality and the potential of a K-shaped recovery after COVID, where those who were already ahead only got further ahead, and those who were previously struggling had fewer chances to catch up. We also asked those arts leaders how they could best prepare to deal with these impacts of the pandemic and evolving uncertainty. And there were lots of important pieces in response, including leadership skills and capacity building, access to reliable audience data and projections. But two key elements that bubbled up to the top were business planning and scenario planning resources. And overall, it seemed to us in thinking about this research that the new normal would be one of increased uncertainty and complexity, and that arts organizations were going to need to find new ways to help them think about how to plan and respond. So at AEA, we turned to think about how we might help those organizations build that capacity, especially focusing around this idea of scenario planning, a tool that has been used in corporate settings for a number of decades, but in our experience at least, had not seen as much use in arts and culture. And this was around April at this point, and for us, scenario planning was, interesting for a number of reasons, but importantly, because we saw COVID shortening those planning horizons to weeks and days. Thinking about questions about how do we keep people safe? When can we get our doors back open? Scenario planning emerged as an idea about how we could extend that planning horizon back out to 5 years, 10 years, or even further to ensure that those organizations didn't get lost in the short term and could best position themselves for success and impact in the long term. And this is a process that we think sort of has 5 core goals that it can ideally help organizations achieve. So first, to provide a framework for planning in conditions of uncertainty that we've been talking about. It is a futures-oriented way of thinking, and I note that plural S in futures is important because the process of long-term scenario planning is really an opportunity to think beyond near-term predictions and be more imaginative about the multiple possible outcomes likely during times of uncertainty. Second, to ensure that planning accounts for wider social, economic, and other external forces that are likely to have significant impacts on organizations. Third, to guard against systemically optimistic or pessimistic thinking and against groupthink, making sure that people's assumptions are out in the open, exposing them to a bit of sunlight outside of your own head and talking about these with other people. Fourth, to find commonalities within possible futures that can be planned for today, and to promote a nimble or agile response when outcomes are in doubt, ensuring that the ultimate aims of a process like this are action-oriented. And then lastly, and we think importantly, to identify how individuals and organizations can focus on their core purpose and be proactive shapers within and between potential futures, hopefully guiding toward more positive outcomes for the organization and the surrounding communities. So how do we go about this? Well, we started the process first by scanning the major forces that are out both in the sector and beyond, with the potential to significantly impact arts and culture. And this leveraged our existing work, tracking and monitoring these global trends to create maps of future landscapes. From that background, we then crafted an initial set of future scenarios for consideration by arts and cultural organizations. Importantly, this process is one that embraces uncertainty. So these aren't predictions, but they're rather views of alternative outcomes that might exist in one form or another. And then we tested what we had created with an advisory group that Mark mentioned earlier that he was a part of. And we assembled a group of leaders from across the sector and even beyond to help us think about these things. Their feedback really helped us understand how the scenarios could be taken as a starting point that could be modified and adjusted in different ways to each organization's particular context or concerns. And this showed us that the process is really not about the scenarios themselves, but rather about how they are used to help an organization understand likely implications for its future, for its community or communities, and what it means to carry out its mission and purpose. And the last step then was to try to understand how cultural organizations could pick these up and best use them. What sorts of tools would we need alongside? How could we explain the process so that somebody will be able to pick it up and make this an actionable process that results in better understanding of future directions? So we tested these draft tools in different ways with 8 different groups, each of which sort of picked up the tools and shook them in a variety of ways to give us more helpful feedback about the process and how we could guide other people through it in this release with the Wallace Foundation. So where did we end up? With a toolkit that we hope aims to turbocharge the scenario planning process by providing the work that we've done as background so that organizations can quickly focus their energy toward understanding the impact for their specific situation and context. The toolkit we created includes 3 main documents. The first is the overview, which is sort of the core of it, and probably the first document you should pick up in the process. The second, the set of detailed scenarios that looks at 4 possible futures in 5 years' time. And then the third, a set of planning worksheets that can help organizations organize thoughts about how to convert their thinking through the process into action. And then there's a fourth document that is a literature review we put together about scenario planning that might be helpful for those interested in diving deeper behind the process. So that first document, to give you a bit of a deeper tour, is the overview. And this discusses a background to the process, highlights some of the uses of scenario planning and the thinking that went into these. The overview also provides an outline of the scenarios and a 1-page introduction to each scenario. We've graphed these scenarios across 2 axes that we think are both important to the sector and perhaps best explain the range of outcomes they represent. One, highlighting the course of the pandemic, whether it's contained or uncontained. And then second, the social response to the upheaval it represents and our resulting propensity to gather in physical spaces. And it's worth noting that while these are the 2 axes we've pulled out, there are many other trends and variables operating behind them as well, most of which are worth exploring in greater depth too. And then behind these scenario pages are some further pages that highlight common threads between the scenarios and provide an introduction to how organizations might use this process. The next document, the detailed scenarios, dives deeper, and this includes 5 pages for each scenario. The introductory story explaining the future, a review of macro forces that are causing the largest impacts, 10 sector indicator metrics that provide a directional look at where arts and culture are headed in each future, a sector-wide analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and then a more detailed look at impacts on a selected set of sector stakeholders. The third document are the planning worksheets, which provide question prompts and worksheets to organize the exploration of each scenario and allow those who are involved in the process to begin to sketch out likely organizational impacts and resource implications. The purpose of these is to help build toward concrete outcomes that can be the basis of planning no matter the future. And then the fourth, as I said, the literature review, which is for those who are interested to go even deeper. And it gives a selected list of general literature on scenario planning good practice and summaries of other scenario planning documents from different contexts. So we hope that these can be helpful tools for a wide variety of organizations. And this, of course, isn't the only way to think long-term and plan for the future. And I hope and expect my fellow panelists will speak to some of the ways they go about that. But we do really think it is one really good way to approach that from a very structured point of view. And we've seen that those who utilize insights from scenario planning are well equipped and more nimble when new opportunities arise or major challenges occur. And that it provides them some confidence to act boldly and move toward outcomes and futures in alignment with their core purpose and mission. So with that, I will stop and turn it back over to Mark and look forward to the conversation with the panel. Thank you again.
Daniel, thank you so much for the presentation. And it really is fascinating material, and the group that we tested with at Opera America found it really, really, really interesting. And I want to emphasize that you talk about possible futures, not predictions. And I like that you delineate between possibilities and predictions, because you are dealing here in preparing for possibilities and not betting the store on a prediction. It's a really important distinction. Now, when you hear from a number of our colleagues, of course, Elizabeth Merritt again, from the American Association of Museums, and just getting right here, sorry, and Christina Newman Scott from BRIC, Elizabeth Merritt from the American Alliance of Museums, and Stephanie Rivera from Baltimore Center Stage. Again, welcome all. At the outset of our discussion, our preparation for this session last week, I asked Lucas and our good friends at the Wallace Foundation what they hoped all of us to get out of this session today. And there were multiple answers, and I just wanted to review those for a moment. They said that they want to give audience members structured frameworks for responding to the possibilities of the future. And I want to emphasize the plural in that sentence, to give audience members structured frameworks, not a fixed framework for the future, but structured frameworks that respond to the possibilities, they're multiple, of the future. For contemplating different futures and related responses to those different possibilities. That there's a process that avoids either excessive optimism or pessimism in our planning, because these days in uncertainty, we can go off in one direction or another. And that we are looking at ways to be flexible, because there will always be surprises, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So how are we flexible as changes come at us? Wallace colleagues want to empower leaders to be nimble, to be able to adjust, to engage in continuous learning, so that we are not stuck in a fixity of information, but are always absorbing new information. That we want to be liberated from betting on one future. We are not being asked to try to roll the dice, decide what the future will be, and then plan for it. How do we stay nimble to adjust to many possibilities? That there is no answer here. We're talking about a mindset that can deal with uncertainty, a mindset that can deal with multiple possibilities, so that we develop a new comfort around not having a specific answer. And an opportunity to engage in new thinking, in new connections, in new partnerships in our communities that develop in light of the pandemic and our response to it, and the call to action for racial justice, greater equity across our sectors. So there are lots of objectives for our session today, and we'll only touch on a few of them. Daniel, I wanted to just start with you with a question, and to differentiate between operating plans, strategic plans, and scenario planning. Because I think lots of times organizations, nonprofit organizations, create operating plans, they mistake them for strategic plans, and then perhaps we might do strategic planning, but mistake it for scenario planning. Can you help us slice and dice this?
Sure, as best I can. I mean, I do think they can be, and probably when they work best, they are very much intertwined with one another. And you can have a scenario planning process at the outset of a strategic plan, and outputs from your scenarios might inform your operating or financial plans as well. So they're not an either or. I think they're really an and between all of these things. And so, you can, however, get sort of specific insights from each of them. And as I said in sort of the introductory presentation, scenario planning in this context in particular, I think is really helpful in picking one's heads up and looking, sort of beyond the horizon that we normally get to look to in this sector, to that near term, 1 year, if you're doing a strategic plan, maybe 3 or 5 years as a common horizon. Start to think about things, 10 years out, 20 years out even, and how you can plug into those trends. But that's not all you need to do. You need to then make that actionable. So I think there are things in strategic planning and sort of the operational planning or business planning that can be very helpful for that. Strategic planning about structuring a process around it that really helps you build a consensus, and maybe help you think about what are the action steps you need to take, or what are the resources you need to implement. And then from a business planning perspective, thinking about all of the different triggers that could change your, your underlying financial reality and how you can marshal the resources to make these things become real in different scenarios is really important. So I think scenario planning is a great sort of starting point. It's not the be all end all as a planning process.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We'll come back with a few questions about that. Now, Christina, in our conversation last week, you acknowledged that even if you're good at imagining future possibilities, you're still going to be taken by surprise. And that our planning, that we ourselves, mentally, intellectually, and our planning processes need to be like rubber bands. And, I understand the words and I can see the analogy, but what do you mean by being like a rubber band?
I'm gonna have to start putting that on a sticker or something now. But I don't know. I thought of a rubber band because it's, rubber bands are resilient. They bounce back. You can like loop forward with them, and I find that when there's too much rigidity around the planning process, or too much weight put on maybe strategic plans that the institution did previously, that prevents you from seeing opportunity, right? You truly have to, and it's very hard, but live in this moment and be present in this moment in order to pivot in the moment, right? Because if you take your complete toolkit pre-pandemic with you now, you're not going to be able to build the future that you want to come out. And no one is trying to go back. There is no going back pre-pandemic, right? Like even in our ideal world when we're all healthy and vaccinated and we're together, sure. But the methodologies and all we've learned even now, things are just going to be shifting. So I say that to say that being agile is really important. And it's funny that we have to reinforce that kind of agility in the creative sector. We've become a little bit box neat, but I know that we're going to talk about that later.
Yeah,
but that's
so
essentially
true.
what I mean.
And Christina, you also said that doing is the best form of thinking. Was something that I noted from last week's conversation. And somehow is that the opposite of what you're talking about, where you just sort of just do and hope for the best? Or do you really see doing as a form of experimentation?
Well, I think yes, I see it more as a form of experimentation. But when I say doing is the best form of thinking and learning too, a lot of times when we get into these conference rooms at work or virtually, we forget all the learning that have taken us to this point. All of us in arts administration have frontline experience, either as an artist or an administrator, or some information that we learned to get us here. And when I say doing, it's really important to reflect on what we learned on our journey. And so with that in mind, and doing for today, putting those two together will allow you to experiment in a way that's just more authentic and responsive, meeting the needs of your audience or your community in ways that are just going to keep you, make you continue to be relevant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. And I noted in our conversation that we still, though, use the terminology of a planning framework or planning structure. And all of these terms, framework, structure, imply a certain kind of rigidity. And we somehow need to find new vocabulary that will embrace the
Please.
fluidity that you're talking about.
Make it happen. Danielle, that's your next project.
Yeah, say,
Find that new vocabulary.
we probably need that the most of anybody to expand beyond. But I think it's a really great opportunity as you're thinking about those little tiny experiments, even in times of real uncertainty. There's almost no better time than to like just sort of put that next foot forward. You don't really know what's out there, but nobody does. So maybe you don't want to bet the farm on what's happening next, but what can you find as just little tests, like, oh, maybe this will work, maybe the audience will love this, maybe people will be really interested about this, and just kind of go for it in some
Yeah,
places.
tiny tests. I love that.
Now, Daniel, I wanted to go back to you before going on to Elizabeth and Stephanie. You mentioned that you think scenario planning needs to be integrated into daily work. And yet, when we look at the tool that you've developed, and it's just brilliant, it's a kind of tool that almost asks you to step out of your normal work day and devote a planning retreat or a planning weekend or some other kind of special intervention to do scenario planning. How do you see the larger scale scenario planning that you put into the tool integrated into daily work?
Sure. So, I mean, it's a good question, and I think we can't deny that probably at the outset, if you've never, sort of approached thinking like this, it probably does take some, real engagement up front to kind of
Mm.
live in each of these possible futures and understand what that might be like, and think about what the implications would be for your organization. But it shouldn't then stay in your half-day workshop or weekend retreat or whatever you might have. You need to find ways to bring it back into the daily lives of the organization. And I think a couple ways to maybe think about that. One, and this is something that another one of your advisory board members brought up to us, Andrew Blau, who does this a lot at Deloitte. He said, as much as a detail as you think the names of each of those scenarios are, it actually can be really important to come up with like an interesting name that people in your organization can refer back to, so that okay, right now we're talking about new means of gathering, or right now we're talking about cooperative living, and just sort of use that as a shorthand as you think about it moving forward. I think
So
I would say another area to highlight is just the like thinking about these as trends that you can track, and what are the indicators that you should be looking to know which future or which pieces of the future you're most likely to be headed toward. And so that's another thing where, on a maybe not daily basis in that case, but on a regular basis, you should be coming back to and saying, does it look like we're headed more toward a scenario one, or it looks like we're
yeah,
headed more toward scenario three, and then think about what that means for your planning and your day-to-day execution.
yeah. Now, Elizabeth and Stephanie, I saw you both shaking your heads in agreement with what Daniel was saying. So, Elizabeth, let me turn to you. What were you agreeing with there? I have another question for you, but I'll get to that in a
Yes,
minute.
sure. Well, I amen to everything Daniel said, because the habit of strategic foresight isn't something where you go and do it at particular times. It's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of thinking about the world. And when I teach people about scenario planning and how to do that in the context of futures thinking, it starts with how you read the news. When you open your news feeds in the morning, when you open your newspaper, and you see a story, thinking about the implications. Oh, what would that mean about how the future could be different? Is that taking us more in the direction of this scenario or that scenario? And I think with that kind of mindset and training, it creates a continuum in your organization. So it isn't like, oh, we're going to go do scenario planning. Oh, that's right, we did it last year, but we forgot what we said. It influences how you approach your work every day and how you see the world.
Now, Stephanie, here you are, artistic director of one of the most important theater companies in the United States, and you hear about this mindset of scenario planning and opening the paper in the morning. You might see it as the paper offers you a good idea for a new play. Here, they're suggesting that opening the paper gives you a sense of direction within a strategic scenario framework. How do you reconcile the practical with this more theoretical?
I love that question. Thank you. I I actually open the paper or my phone these days, and it's not so much a play that comes to mind, but it actually is the broader cultural context in which we're operating. And I just wanted to lift up a couple. So the things that I'm bringing with me into every meeting at Baltimore Center Stage these days has a lot to do with the threads that Daniel, Elizabeth, and Christina have laid out. In that, we were engaged in a strategic planning process before the pandemic hit, and that in so many ways, our strategic goals for that sort of 7 generations ahead kind of thinking, those strategic goals have remained unchanged.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about the sort of broader civic participation from Baltimore Center Stage and all of the areas and et cetera, those things are unchanged. Mm. And but the way that we are proceeding down that strategic path has everything to do with what Christina was talking about with regards to building resiliency. It has to do with what Elizabeth is talking about, which I sort of hear as cultural competency, and putting those pilots, those small experiments into action every day, and then iterating and iterating and iterating and iterating, and we never stop iterating. So that's the broader cultural shift that sort of is foundational to any of the policy shifts or the sort of expansion or contraction of our budgets, but the cultural shift is underpinning the sort of scenario planning and the overall strategy and the and.
Thank you for that. Elizabeth, you mentioned the risk of getting sidetracked by latest idea or trend in this work. And how do you ensure that the examination of ideas remains rigorous and continuous?
Yes, this is kind of deeply ironic, Mark, because the Alliance has spent decades convincing museums of the importance of having a plan. Because when we started the accreditation program over 40 years ago, we learned over the decades that one of the biggest problems was even very sound institutions would have problems that lasted for years and years because those decisions, which seem good in the short run, you know, the shiny object, somebody wants to give us a gift for a new wing, or somebody offered to fund this program, all seemed like good short-term decisions, but they didn't have that context for the long term, the strategic framework that Daniel referred to. So, you know, we've been emphasizing the importance of having the plan, both the strategic plan and the operational plan. And frankly, since the turn of the century, we've already been getting some pushback from organizations that said, well, you know, we think maybe that framework of thinking about planning is a little outmoded. It's not about writing a plan, it's about a continual process of planning. Because directors were telling us, you know, it's something that changes every day. You can't just write the plan. 3 months later, there are major differences that mean you have to adjust your thinking. So we've already been wrapping our head around that, and now this happens. And in this world, change is so radical and so rapid. You can't just say, well, our goal was this, right? And remain focused on that and don't get distracted by what happened. It's not a distraction. It's a really big, important thing that you have to pay attention to. I think that the beauty of scenario planning is it gives you enough boundaries to keep you focused on the important end goal and helps you identify what the really important issues are and distinguish them from distractions. So the important disruption versus the attractive shiny object.
Really very, very helpful construct there. Now, Christina, I'm going to come back to something that you said already, and that you were surprised, and I completely agree with you, that nonprofit organizations, especially nonprofit arts organizations, aren't as nimble as they ought to be, because we display a certain organizational rigidity even while we are supporting the work of artists who are creative, spontaneous, responsive, and there's a kind of mismatch between the organizational rigidity and the fluidity of the artistic process. So how has this been manifested in your own experience?
Well, I'm going to answer that. And yes, and I want to piggyback off of something Elizabeth said, because as you were speaking and just reflecting on what Stephanie said, you know, right before, well, in November 2019, our board at BRIC approved a strategic plan that was human-centered. When I got hired, it was the first thing I kind of led was the strategic planning process that was very human-centered. And we brought in the entire staff, you know, as strategic planning does, right? We bring in a lot of stakeholders, but from top to bottom in the institution, every single person, we have 100 full-time staff, was touched. They had space to a seat at the table, and we mix match board with artists and staff, and we did the whole thing. That plan, which was approved in November, has been such a grounding force for us as a, you know, because it was rooted in what the people that we serve need. It wasn't rooted in like 5 of us in a boardroom over coffee. So it was just listening. It's so good. Planning is great, especially when it is rooted in being responsive to the people that we serve and prioritized by them in many ways. And so back to the thing that you're posing, Mark, with how did we get here? Like, how in God's name are we all part of an arts and cultural sector that has overprivileged corporate hierarchy and metrics of success that are so far and beyond what got us here in the first place, when we think about what brought us into the arts, I can promise you no one said it was like a 5-point business plan that got them into the arts, right? No one said, oh my God, I was so inspired by that like business plan, I had to work in the arts. Like that is not what happened. So then how, as we, especially on this call, as we've ascended in our careers into further and further leadership, increasing leadership roles, how have we become so far removed? It's because our models are upside down. We are using, in many respects, wrong models. We are applying methodologies and hierarchical approaches to our nonprofit sector that is just in conflict and not in harmony, which then wastes a lot of time for us having to like prove our worth, prove our value. What does success look like? And if we're not in alignment on those things, we'll always be feeling like we're on this hamster wheel, this disconnected hamster wheel, and struggling to find structures that, that might not quite be where we're looking. And I'm not making an argument against structure at all. I'm saying that there is a skill set within our sector, arts and cultural sector, that should be honored. And there should be more curiosity about how the people that we are serving and us want to get there, versus applying a methodology that might come from Citicorp or, or board led, that maybe they just don't understand.
And it is the disjuncture in a way between the artistic process, which is to be like no one else, to have a fresh and new voice, to go where no one has gone before, and the board mindset, which is frequently related to preservation and conservation and protection. And not that that is what is in the contract with a board member, but they come to the board table with that sense of preserving the institution and preserving the art form as it has been inherited, whereas the artists are seeking to do something that's never been done before. And how helpful it is at the moment to have this enormous cleansing, if you will, an erasing of the board. So that way, when we are repopulating our performance schedule, when we are welcoming people back into our spaces again, we might do it differently because there has been such an interruption. And is it possible that the ingenuity we will need to come out of the pandemic in a healthy state might align better with the ingenuity of artists themselves, who are already creating in new forms?
I hope so.
Have you found this kind of rub between the board desire to preserve and protect and the artist's desire to innovate?
Was that for me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I, at the risk of sounding like that person, in short, no. Just at Baltimore Center Stage, I feel incredibly lucky. I won the artistic director lottery with this board. Has there been rigor around our discussions? Yes. But at every step of the way, my executive partner, Michael Ross, and I have been able to sort of lay out create the possibilities, preserve the possibilities, and lay out those different sort of scenarios and paradigms for our board in such a way that they are all understanding of this moment. It cannot be a stop moment. It must be a bridge moment. And a sort of an iterative moment and an evolution rather than a sort of hard left turn. And so by and large at Baltimore Center Stage, at least, and I know that this is not the case across the field, but every time we've asked our board to sort of show up and stand shoulder to shoulder with us in preservation of our jobs and our ability to create art, which also creates jobs, and to sort of keep our values intact around the way we compensate people and how we support our artists. They've been there every step of the way. And in fact, our sort of, I think, nobody loves that we're not in our building, but everybody understands that inside of each one of our programming moments, that virtually we are embedding strategic experiments, and we are embedding the lessons that we will learn and carry into the future. So it's all it's all upside in terms of the other side of this. We're going to come out the other side with more tools and sort of more resilience.
That's how we feel at Brick in many ways in terms of coming out the other side. We've just learned an incredible amount. It's good to hear that, but I would say throughout my career, it's uncommon. That, you know what I mean? But it's good.
Yeah.
It's good.
Now, Daniel, I'm going to come to you in a second about involving artists in the process. But Elizabeth, I wanted to pick up a couple of things that you said last week about the potential for tunnel vision, the potential for living in the bubble of the thoughts that have been passed along, or the governance thoughts of preservation. How do you see tunnel vision occurring? How do you see us breaking out of the bubble? What are techniques, strategies that you've seen at your great institutions?
Yes, though I will say as a side note, Mark, that museum boards are inherently a little bit more about preservation just because of the nature of museums, which isn't
exactly.
To say
I mean, you're
thinking...
conserving the art. You're absolutely conserving the art.
Yeah.
But I think that part of that conservative or preservative thinking that you're referring to arises from the fact that the boards of trustees of American museums are amazingly homogeneous. To start with, they're overwhelmingly white. We did a report in 2017 together with BoardSource that documented that 93% of museum directors are white, 90% of board members are white, and in fact, 46% of museum boards are entirely white. And that's just one parameter of diversity, right? And unfortunately, that homogeneity tends to get perpetuated because boards largely recruit from their circles of people they know, of people they work with. So even in terms of thinking about who should be on the board, they tend to be constrained. And of course, it's difficult to diversify because we're finding right now, even as we help support museums in the effort to increase, say, the racial diversity of their boards, it's such a change in mindset because we tend, even when we recruit for diversity, the message we send then is, but you should behave exactly like the people who are already there, right? That's the model of correct thinking. So even when we bring on people who aren't like us, we may not really want them to challenge the status quo. So in the long run, I think the strongest tool is creating more diverse boards of trustees. That's going to be a long and difficult process. In the short run, if you have a board with the people who are on that board now faced with a challenging situation like this, and having the need to expand their own thinking without necessarily the benefit of being challenged by other people at the table who have different experiences and different approaches, I think, to circle back to strategic foresight, one of the best ways to break out of that is to have a scaffold and a framework that pushes them to challenge their own expectations. What if that weren't true? What if things were different? How would you respond to this happening? So the kind of toolkit that we're looking at with AEA is saying, this is a way for you to have the comfort of a structure and a process that will push you outside your comfort range.
Keeping in mind that the scaffolding and the structure need to be made of rubber, so that way they are nimble and they just
structure
don't
of rubber band.
Rubber band. It's a
we
rubber
have
band.
to keep that. And I think in terms of getting out of the bubble, it touches, Daniel, on what you were saying about the importance of artists in this process. Because
Sure.
if the board is in one room and the artists are in another room, and we don't bring together the spontaneity and inventiveness and creativity and the passion of the artist into the board governance role and scenario planning related to that, then we're missing something. What's your observation about that?
For sure. I mean, this whole sort of last segment of the conversation, I think, speaks to the idea that who you have around the table, whether it's, scenario planning or, day-to-day planning or, anything, is incredibly important. And if you don't get more of those voices around the table, it's going to be hard to take it as, as far as you might be able to possibly go otherwise. And artists are one part of that, and I'll talk about them more in a second and some of the things we've seen them do in these processes. But you could say the same thing about community members or other stakeholders that maybe you don't get an opportunity to talk to as much. Scenario planning is maybe a great opportunity to go say, look, we're thinking really big picture here. We want your insights. Please come and join us as we think about the future together. And that's critical. to making, I think, a long-term successful setup. Now, artists in particular, I think have a super unique role in that, and we've been fortunate enough to do some of these scenario planning processes where organizations have invited artists to sit alongside your senior staff and board members and funders, the normal people you usually sit around the table in these conversations. And it's the imagination that they bring. I mean, what are artists better at than looking at a situation and completely flipping it on its head and presenting it back to everybody in a compelling way? So just in conversation, they're valuable in producing a new viewpoint and making people think about things in a different way. But you can also take a scenario planning or the creation of those scenarios as a bit of a creative process themselves. And we've seen organizations illustrate future scenarios. We've seen organizations turn them into one-act plays, or put some choreography to them, or and there are lots of interesting ways that artists can get involved with helping people kind of live in those different futures and see how they might play out.
Yeah, and it seems to me that in our quest, our commitment to racial justice and to diversity in other dimensions, even age diversity and just diversity of perspectives, that bringing artists into the process will accelerate dramatically the connection of our organizations to community, the way just changing up our board a little bit won't quite do. We've got to go faster, bigger than that. And that artists provide that incredible connection to community, the lens, and the diversity that we're thirsty for. Have other organizations had positive experience and ways to achieve artist participation? Stephanie, you were talking about Baltimore Center Stage. I'm sure artists were among the 100 people on your staff who were giving input to your strategic plan.
Yeah, we employ artisans, and I take a sort of expansive understanding of the word artist too, that is, yes, the actor, the gig worker. It is also the carpenter who works in our shop. And when I think about some of our most sort of bold experiments coming out of our own sort of planning for a more racially just Baltimore Center Stage, it was a person on our staff who is also a theater maker, a playwright. Her name is Annalisa Diaz, and she was the one who said, what we could do is this thing instead of this thing. And it just unlocked a whole sort of new paradigm, I think, for me. And so being in conversation with artists and helping, I think that there's a virtuous cycle that I feel like we need to be creating, because there are logistical, legal, financial, like ethical, more all the things. We're still operating within constraints of our organizations and our communities and our legal systems and our labor laws. And within that, there are infinite possibilities. And the extent to which we can create a kind of virtuous cycle of communication is the extent to which I feel like artists will get in there and dream with us, and is the extent to which everybody else who doesn't self-identify as an artist has proximity to that kind of thinking, because as Elizabeth said earlier, it is a mindset. It's a skill set, but it is also a mindset.
Christina, I see you nodding your head. Have you had a similar experience at BRIC?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have a lot of artists, practicing artists on our staff in varied positions, but we also have annually artists in residence that really help us drive our thinking, allow us to kind of question our assumptions. An artist in particular, Yasmani Arboleda, was with us last year and conceived of the Future Historical Society as part of a program that we did with NYCHA housing residents in our community. And it was a kind of this forward-looking reimagining Fort Greene in Brooklyn, led by, Yasmani sees himself as kind of a conduit. And it was just so phenomenal. And it was so, I am my best self. And I think our organization is our best self when you can see and feel the energy of the artist at work in the space. It's got to feel like something is, there's something being made here, that creativity is happening. It doesn't necessarily have to be on show per se, but that is a feeling that I hope that as we move forward, that we don't lose sight of the fact that we are only relevant with artists, right? Like we are irrelevant without a true partnership and true power sharing with artists. And so we've had the great pleasure of working with many artists at Brick in deep and meaningful ways.
In our meeting last week, Lucas asked the question, what might you do wrong right now? Or what is or could be done wrong right now? And Elizabeth, you said certainty.
Yes.
Certainty is the wrong thing. Could you explain a little bit what you meant by that?
Yes. Well, there's this wonderful diagram that I love showing to people when I explain what I do as a futurist, which is called the cone of plausibility. And it's basically saying, look, we think that we're heading right straight ahead and that the future is going to be just like today, except more so. And what you have to realize is there isn't one future. There are many possible futures, and we can't be certain about which one we're going to land in. This is what scenario planning is about. And that if you cultivate the mindset of uncertainty, of realizing that tomorrow could be different, you can begin to cultivate agency. How could I make the future different? What is the future I want to live in? And I think this is the real power of switching from just organizational, institutional planning to scenario planning. I hate to say it, but there are some people out in the public who don't care about a museum, right? They're not museum people. And you may not be able to make them care in the short term, but they care about the world they live in. And if you go to them and say, I'm planning for what we want our museum to be in 10 years, but you go to them and you say, we want to plan for how the world can be a better place in 10 years. Would you help us with that? Because we want to figure out how the museum can help that happen. Then they care.
Mm-hmm. I like your relationship between the fluidity and agency. When you're in a fluid situation, you have more of a role in determining the outcome. And that's just a really great equation. You also said last week that in terms of goal setting, that the need to get away from numbers and dates and get to clear values. Again, could you explain that?
Yes, well, I'm going to riff off something Christina said, because Christina, you were referring to the fact that maybe some of the structures that we've inherited from business aren't appropriate to the arts. And I think one of those has been the focus on certain metrics. And we're caught in this constant tension between measuring what we can measure, right, but measuring things that really matter. So with museums, attendance. Well, actually, it's really hard to measure attendance, but at least it's something theoretically you can measure. So let's measure that. But is that really the most important thing? Museums were already struggling with that, but now in the pandemic, it's become abundantly clear that many of the traditional measures of, what was attendance, how many people came to this exhibit, were there learning outcomes from people going through, those are not what matters right now. It really forces us to look at the big picture of what does matter. So to go back to my formulation of how do you want to make the world a different place, when I work with museums, I challenge them. I say, when you're talking about mission, what you're answering is the question, how will the world be different because we exist? And I think right now for the pandemic and with the upheavals we're going through and trying to grapple with racial justice, the very specific question is, how will your community have gotten through this time in a better manner, have survived better, had less of an impact on vulnerable populations because of what you as the museum did? So to focus on values, who is it you want to take care of on your staff, in your community, and how can you focus your energy and assets on helping them get through this time?
Could I jump in to punctuate this a bit?
Please.
Because it resonates a lot, and it is reminding me too of something that Daniel said earlier. And I just want to lift up and amplify what Elizabeth is saying about co-constructing the world we want to live in, and how our arts institutions and our artists are, first and foremost, they're storytellers, whatever their medium. And they're reflecting our world, but they're also co-constructing the multiple futures that we have at our disposal. And I wonder, and this is a conversation we're having at Baltimore Center Stage too, when we talk about participation, for us, I would give my right arm for an attendance metric because it's ticket sales, which is different from attendance. So I would love to get attendance because that gets me away from ticket sales. But But even still, I think about that word participation. And the way we talk about it, we frame it in terms of who is participating with us, with our programming, with our building. And it makes me curious. This is the active question with me and my team now. What is the metric around participation for our organization in the community? Not outreach, but actively participating in what our community, whatever way you define it, what it looks like. And insofar as we might measure the number of press hits, right? The number of press mentions is a viable metric for how we're doing in the world. Why aren't we also measuring the number of city council meetings that I do or don't show up to, or a member of my staff doesn't, independent of a kind of reciprocal expectation, but just actually contributing and participating in the civic life of a community?
Yeah, so well said. Now, I've seen the number of questions just the counter going up and up and up in the Q&A. So Lucas, I have skipped over lots of questions that I had in my notes. This conversation is just getting started. I wish it could be over dinner in a delicious restaurant. If we could only gather, we'd go all night. Lucas, welcome back, and let's talk about some questions. There are a lot, and I'm taking a quick look at them myself. I've opened it up, and just a lot of affirmation about never stop iterating, and the importance of that. One question here: how do large organizations fend off decision fatigue while balancing operation everyday COVID planning? Yeah, I mean, it is a wearing moment, and yet another layer of questions on top of that. But it's my guess, Daniel, maybe you would answer that some of the day-to-day may be made easier by the clarity about some of the scenario planning thoughts. Daniel?
I mean, I think we hope that would be the case at the very least. I mean, what you find when you have time to plan, when you're not in sort of the conditions of crisis or the uncertainty that we've seen over the last 8 or so months, is that you're better able to approach the future. And so it's not about adding a layer of decisions on top of it. It's about, okay, knowing what you can fall back on, having a sort of a steady foundation that you can launch forward from, wherever you may have ended up that we wouldn't have expected when we went down that path.
I have a good question here from my friend, and I admire him so much, Sunil Iyengar at the NEA. The idea of little experiments. Intrigued about that, and how can the culture of little experimentation be fostered in arts organizations? I'm reminded of what Jared Diamond said in his book Collapse, which is that fragile societies don't innovate because they're scared that the slight experiment will cause them to fail even faster. And I've sometimes thought that, although Jared Diamond, doesn't know it, that arts organizations are like fragile societies where we keep doing the same thing because to vary it and fail will be worse than anything. So how do you build little experiments into the operating plan? Stephanie, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think that little experiments can be scaled as well. So it might be a little experiment inside of a normal production process for me, that the little experiment might be, we're going to have pay equity across the board. Imagine that little experiment. Does it bankrupt us? No, it turns out it doesn't bankrupt us. Let's keep going. What are we going to do next? And I think, and it could also be a piece of programming. So I am always wary of launching a whole new program. I'm first going to do one project, have one event, and then learn from it and see if we can scale it up and start tweaking things along the way. But I think one of the keys is, and I'd be curious to hear Christina speak on this as well. I think one of the key components of experimentation is to make it visible and to be explicit with this is the experiment. This is what we're trying to learn. Now, what did we learn from it? What are we going to take? What are we going to evolve? And to be incredibly clear when an experimentation is operating, and to be able to tie it back to previous experiments too. And it helps to build a culture of learning. more than
Yeah,
Yeah.
I see lots of heads there. A wonderful
100%.
consultant who's worked with Opera America always says, no, you learn from your colossal failures, but actually you learn more from your little successes.
Yeah.
And that, if you structure that little success and figure it out and learn from it, you can move forward. Christina, how would you respond to Stephanie? And then Daniel, I saw you nodding your head vigorously.
Yeah, I think that the comment earlier about fair, what you said, Mark, about fair, you know, when right in March, when we all shut down, right, because of COVID, it was really important to brick our staff and our board to secure and keep everyone, all 100 full-time staff members safe, right? So we had the financial capacity to do so. And so we prioritized our people. And so people can't innovate when they are fearful or don't feel safe. And so thinking about, I'm spending a lot of time with our community thinking about the social and emotional well-being of our people. In Jamaica, we say, you can't dance a yard, you can't dance abroad till you dance a yard, right? Like you have to learn how to take care of your own house first in order to go out and teach and do. And I think Stephanie's so right that, it can be scaled. And so first for us at BRIC, it's about how are we as a community feeling strength, safe, and the ability to innovate and know that if we fail, that no one's gonna get upset, no one's gonna lose their job. Like people are really afraid right now. So building that trust is important. And then I love the idea of scaling. We do that too. Right now we are doing a full salary compensation study. That is a kind of a big experiment at BRIC. It's not a little one, but that's gonna create the ripple effect of that is gonna be so fruitful for the entire team. And we're doing it programmatically with the marketing team, and we're doing it in media. We've had, I don't know, a 350% increase from nonprofits in Brooklyn asking us and in New York City to help them with digital literacy. Like that to us was like, all right, let's see what we can do to help. So we started helping the first 5, then we helped 10, then we're doing small business, then we're training small businesses. That's a whole side of the business we weren't really doing in this way formally, right? So that's another little experiment.
Yep. Daniel, again, affirmative nodding there. What do you have to add here?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, a lot to emphasize in there. I was going to say, I think I started my most vigorous nodding when Stephanie was talking about sort of how do you capture the learnings from all of this, is so that you're not just sort of going out there and saying, I'm going to do a little experiment and we'll see what happens, but actually understanding what you did, why you did it, and what the outcome was. If we're not, we're trying to get away from talking about frameworks or whatever in this conversation. So, is it a spider web or piece of flypaper that makes you sticky so that you capture all these things and be able to turn them into something useful and productive in the next iteration. And I just think that's so critical as we're thinking about the learnings from scenario planning or learnings from this idea of thinking in times of uncertainty more broadly.
Elizabeth, something you'd like to add there?
Oh, I just want to say how much I love Stephanie calling it an experiment, because my background is in science. And in a well-designed experiment, you don't have failure. You learn something one way or another. This happens or that happens. And I think part of the problem we have with encouraging this kind of experimentation in cultural organizations is English is an impoverished language when it comes to failure. That's one word that is used to cover a multitude of different things. And we need a word that means, that is awesome. You tried something and it didn't, what you thought would happen didn't happen, but we learned from it. There needs to be one word for that.
Yes.
And building a culture in which whatever that word is, we're embracing it. And the other thing, Mark, that's so important is to budget for it. People who are working 120% of their time on their core job and having to deliver X, Y, and Z, it's not only fear, it's stress. They need some time, they need some space, they need some support, monetary and emotional and moral, to say, yeah, go out and try something. And it's great if we learn from it one way or the other. That's part of your job.
Yeah. One of the questioners, Kenneth Foster, put out here that if you don't set your own metrics of what you're trying to do in an experiment, what you're testing, what your idea is, others will impose those metrics on you. That the importance of the clarity about, just as Stephanie, this is what we want to do, this is what we're trying to get out of it, we'll report back what we get out of it, that if you aren't clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it, others will impose their own interpretations of what you're doing, and you'll be subject to a different set of metrics. I think that's a really good point here. Again, I'm scanning through all these questions here. Lucas, do we have your voice back yet by any chance?
Can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, there we
Oh,
are.
good. Okay.
All right.
Sorry about that. My internet went off and that didn't reset. We have a question from Andrew Taylor, who runs the always interesting Artful Manager blog. And I think it connects to something said earlier about the teaching function of digital literacy. I think that was you, Christina. So Andrew writes, this process would seem even more valuable if approached by multiple organizations together. Is there a plan or possibility to encourage collaborative scenario efforts by discipline, by community, by mission? And I think there are two ways to answer that question. One is there a plan? And the second is, what about lateral thinking within the arts ecosystem? Should scenario planning be only about your organization, or should you think laterally and maybe up and down within the ecosystem?
Yeah, and Lucas, I can just give a quick response to that. And hi, Andrew. When Opera America put together that group of 6 organizations to test the tool, it was an opportunity for us not only to help them in their own thinking about scenario planning, and we learned what each of them might do a little bit differently, but it gave us a chance to look across our sector, at least with these 6 organizations, to see what strategies they had in common and what it means for us as a sector, not just what it means for our members. So I do think, Lucas, that to Andrew's point, there is a benefit in some collective scenario planning, either in a community across disciplines or within a discipline across cities, because there will be a lot of commonalities that define a forward agenda for all of the nonprofit performing arts or display arts.
And not just scenario planning, but that learning and experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to offer that thanks to the Mellon Foundation and the Duke Foundation, Baltimore Center Stage, Long Wharf Theater in New Haven, Connecticut, Woolly Mammoth Theater in DC, and St. Louis Repertory Theater, these are, we could get it. I will not bore you with the details of how that cohort came together. We're all leaders of color, but we came together with the express purpose of saying we are going to implement experiments in programming, in financial modeling, in ticket sale across all 4 of our organizations, so that we are serving as a force multiplying effect. We're having a force multiplying effect on all of our learning and plan, and therefore planning. Mm-hmm. Just to say that was a hard sell it's a hard sell, especially in these times. Yeah. But when that's where I feel like the funding community can really step in and say, right, this is what this is for. This is what this is for. And it has been extraordinary.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We need that funding in order to give us the ability and the confidence, kind of the win that we need, right? But to do that work. This kind of collective wisdom, lateral thinking, I'm more accustomed to seeing it when I was a head of a state arts agency, because we were working nationally with all the other state arts agency heads. But then also when I was running the office in Connecticut, I was working with New England, which is a unique, New England, all the arts agencies in New England. And then for the state of Connecticut, we worked with 9 regional arts councils. So when we did our strategic planning, it was with all the regionals. And it was a really beautiful process. I mean, of course, there's always challenges when you have such a large plan to put into play, but I don't think it's commonplace. And, the unfortunate reality is, because funding is so scarce and we're all trying, and, small to mid to larger to the extremely large, and there's a deficit for smaller and mid-sized arts organizations. The larger ones continually get the largest amount of funding. There's such an inherent fear, and go back to boards wanting to preserve, boards want to protect and preserve the work we do. And that's their role, right? So when they see this, if you come to the table, they're like, wait, what? How is that going to affect our bottom line? What does that mean? And so I would love to shift more intentionally with the funding support to a more collective wisdom sector model, because we would just benefit from it, man. We cannot be crabs in a barrel.
And I would say 2 things that Doug McLennan from Arts Journal passed along to me. One is one of the biggest challenges in going in a new direction is dismantling what came before and of getting people to give up what they have been somehow married to. COVID has given us a great opportunity in creating all of that interference and interruption and erasure for us. So that's one, is that there is this weird golden moment to think differently about where you want to go and how you want to get there. Number two is to remind people who may wish to preserve, conserve, or return to the good old days that the good old days weren't such good old days, that the good old days were characterized by economic fragility, by racism, overt or covert, by all sorts of qualities we don't wish to reinstate, that fragility, the uncertainty, the rigidity of structure. So here we have a remarkable planning opportunity, scenario planning, strategic planning opportunity, because nothing is going to come out the way it was and we don't necessarily want it to. So, take advantage, don't waste a good crisis, as Winston Churchill would say.
I think we
Mark?
could, oh, sorry, go, what
No,
Daniel
I
was.
was going to add on to something Christina said. I think there's a really interesting role in here for government as well as funders. And of course, not to say that the funding isn't needed, but as in the role of convener. Because it turns out that a lot of times you may know you're sort of vertical within the sector, and museums know museums and the theaters know the theaters, but there's a lot to be learned across those disciplines that sometimes, particularly government bodies, get to see. And so I think, that's something certainly worth exploring in greater depth.
I think we have time to sneak in one more question before we need to wrap. And the question is, we've heard a great deal about the benefits of developing more expansive boards. Any practical tips on how to do that, to diversify the board?
I'm doing a presentation for Opera America trustees. We're about 250 people tomorrow afternoon about that. I just want to say that a more diverse board will grow out of better and different work. I think the idea of going after diversity just for diversity's sake is shallow, is tokenistic, and worse. If your organization has deep community partnerships that are long-standing, mutually beneficial, reciprocal, if you are delivering value to others so people begin to care about your own well-being as a museum or an opera company or a theater company, then you can begin to diversify your board. Now, we talked about artists and the participation of others in the community, so we can put that aside for now. But the idea that, for me, diversity must grow from the work, the partnerships, the value in the community outside the walls of the museum or the opera house, then it'll happen, then it'll be authentic, and you can have some real relationships.
Well said.
Here, here.
What
And
Mark said.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
What he said, right?
Thank you, Mark. And I would just, and in closing, I think what you've offered, and I see the assent, is a kind of integrated, holistic perspective with diversity, incorporation of community as part of the organization's DNA. The great Gestalt psychologist, and Gestalt is all about seeing the whole, Kurt Lewin, said that organizations go through 3 stages: freezing, unfreezing, and change, and then refreezing. And one of the themes I think we've heard here, the large theme, is that this is a bit of an unfreezing moment, when amid all the pain and suffering, there may be some opportunities to reimagine a future that might in some ways be better. And I think all of you, all the panelists, thanks to Daniel Payne of AEA Consulting, Mark Skorka of Opera America, Elizabeth Merritt of the Alliance, Christina Newman-Scott of BRIC, and Stephanie Ibarra of Baltimore Center Stage, have given us some pathways forward. We would invite you to join the next in the series, which will be in the new year after the holidays. We'll be sending you all a very brief survey. If you have an extra minute, we hope you'll join it. Your feedback has already been incorporated into the series. And as a reminder, the deck you saw and a recording of this discussion will be posted at wallacefoundation.org. Thank you all panelists for your candor and insights, and thank you for our guests out there in cyberspace. You were so insightful, such good questions and commentary. We're very grateful for this conversation. And as Mark said, perhaps next year in person. Thank you,
Indeed.
everyone. And we
Thank
look
you
forward to
all.
seeing you in the
Thank
new
you all.
year.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.